Well, we welcome you to our roundtable discussion. I am joined today by Julie Piercy,
Mhm.
and I'm so glad to have her with us. We are talking about education and responding to two recent articles.
Mhm.
And so, this is a time of the year where children in some school districts are already back in school. In ours, I was told maybe because of the fair,
Mhm.
school is delayed and starts next week, and there's another fair in our area that's a week later, and so school there starts even later. So there's a little bit of a cultural dynamic to that, and I just think that when we look at education, we find a lot of opportunity for worldview analysis, to consider our role as parents, as educators. Um, Anything introductory there you would like to share before we dive into our articles?
Well, just if you don't know me, I'm a member of First Baptist Church Linesville and have a background in Christian education, Christian children's ministry, and teaching in Christian schools. And so I guess that's maybe why I was asked to be a part of this today. And I'm excited to be here. So thanks for including me.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. And that's one of the things I like to prioritize is when I have the opportunity to sit down and discuss something with somebody, I
Hmm.
want to hear an area that they're gifted in and have experience. And of course, with Pastor Terry, sat down and talked about visitation ministry,
Hmm.
for instance. I love picking somebody's brain and learning from them. So,
Good.
yeah, I know this will be a blessing to you. This first article is from the New York Times. And so, anytime I share an article, I always encourage people to check out the source content and to find it. This may be hidden behind a paywall, depending. They give so many free articles a month, I think, on Google as well as on social media. And so, if you've already hit your limit, I'm not going to encourage you to get a subscription somewhere, but if you want to follow this up, check it out next month when you have more access to
Hmm.
articles. But it's called Texas School District Removes Bible and Anne Frank Adaptation and Back to School Sweep. It says the Keller Independent School District in North Texas reviewed dozens of challenged books during the last school year. It is taking them off the shelves as it reviews them again. And so there were 41 challenged books during the previous school year, but a policy approved by the school district's Board of Trustees last week requires staff to pull the books from shelves so that they can be reviewed again. It goes on to say the last minute book sweep is one of several changes in school districts across the country that will restrict students' access to books in the new school year. This is a school district in Texas, by the way, that serves more than 35,000 students in a portion of Fort Worth and in other North Texas cities. There are responses from different entities in the article. The president of the Board of Trustees, for instance, said in a Facebook post that the review was needed to protect kids from sexually explicit content. Indeed, one of the books, The Bluest Eye, which I am not familiar with, I haven't read it. When I looked it up, it described it. It noted that it describes some issues of racism, some actions that were racist. It describes relationships, including incestuous ones. And so there is some content that is addressed there. And then, if you were to continue reading the article, we find that. That there's another individual who says it is virtually impossible to run a school or a library that purges books in response to any complaint from any quarter. All right, so with that, so just a few kind of discussion prompts here. As we look at this, we note this is culturally significant. The New York Times is covering it
Hmm.
because there is a trend where books are being challenged, removed from um, some libraries, some classrooms. Content is being curriculums being reevaluated in many school districts around the country. But what made parents interested in classroom books or curriculum at this particular time?
Hmm. It's a great question. I think there's several factors. I think the debate about critical race theory, also known as CRT, has likely been an impetus
Mm.
for renewed interest in parents wanting to know what their children are learning at school. And the current political climate, too, in which leaders and parties are at such opposing odds and viewpoints, is probably the other, in my opinion.
Mm.
There's a tangible battle over our children's education that's been long overdue,
Mm.
really. When I was in college in the 80s and 90s, I met my very first homeschooler. And yet today we know many families that homeschool, and I've done so myself for a few years there. So there's just kind of a cultural change that way too.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Julie described there, we have these cultural conflicts, and whichever side of the spectrum you fall on those, it's a fact that there has been increased hostility towards opposing viewpoints. There is a vocalization of individual values and beliefs. And I think one of the things that has triggered this kind of response has been the pandemic. Parents were at home with children, and not that parents were disengaged, but I think that there was this expectation that we send our children off to schools and they're just learning, the basics. They're charting out Abraham Lincoln's life, and they learn how many times he wasn't elected before he finally was, and those sort of things. And then all of a sudden, children are at home, and the parents trying to work from home, and they overhear classroom discussions, and they say, "What was that? What are you learning about?" And then whether it was some of the national issues that were happening, some of the discussions that were happening on a big scale, and the election of 2020 and all of the political upheaval and all of that, maybe some things got linked to those kind of discussions, and parents became concerned, or there was just content that they questioned: is this appropriate for my child? And so as children were put back in classrooms, in the physical classrooms, I think it was inevitable that parents were going to want to speak into that. And so with that, it kind of, as we're kind of unpacking worldview assumptions, as we're doing worldview analysis, should Christian parents have a say in what their children are taught? Should they desire to have a say? They hear something maybe that they perceive to be problematic, or even in some cases going against biblical values. Should parents have a say in what their children are taught? And if so, is there a limit to that influence?
So many in our culture would say, no, it's none of your business. You're not the educator. Let the professionals do their jobs and so forth. But the Bible has a different view on it. Proverbs 22:6 tells us that if we train a child in the way he or she should go, that when they're old, they won't depart from that. And twice in Deuteronomy, we're instructed to talk about our faith in the morning and at night, but also when we walk along the way or when we're sitting together. So really throughout the day. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've preached from Deuteronomy 6 many times about parental responsibilities, and we connect everything that happens in the world to a biblical worldview. We describe things with our children about history, both success and failure, moral failure and evil. This is sin problems in our culture, and ones that have been problematic throughout history. We talk about creation and how wonderful our Creator is, and how things are designed for a purpose. And so we've spent a good bit of time developing that, and I trust all parents should. I believe parents should have a say. We are responsible for our children. In our discussion before this video, we sit down and talk a little bit before, but Julie brought up the fact that from Dr. James Dobson, that our parental influence shifts as our children develop. Would that be a good way to characterize that?
That is. Those of you who are parents remember those early days when you brought your little Levy home, and they needed fed around the clock and diapers changed, and they needed comforted and all those kind of things. And as they grow, they need those things to various levels. So you go from having 100% control when they're an infant until they're 18, when in this culture you really have no control. So you're always kind of trying to find, where is that line? And how do I leverage the things I'm doing to be constructive in teaching my child without driving him or her away? And I just love that analogy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I think we need to be invested in every aspect of our children's lives. We're accountable to the state. One, if you just decide, hey, I'm not going to send my children to school, that would be problematic. And we're also accountable, of course, to God for our role as guardians of our children, of people mentoring them and pointing them towards Jesus Christ. But is there a limit to that influence?
Well, I think that there's not a limit to your influence. There's a limit to the practical application.
Mm-hmm.
If your child goes to public school, and that's a great option for many families,
Mm-hmm.
and it's free. It's included in the tax money you pay, and should be taken advantage of. You can't go to school with your child every day. You
Right.
can't dictate what chapters of history books are going to be taught or so forth, but in the ways that you can be involved, getting to know teachers, becoming active as a volunteer at their school, either running for school board or attending school board meetings where some of these issues come out, and being aware, building relationships with your children's teachers. But in terms of being there every day, or thinking that you're going to go into a classroom and sit in the back and just see what's happening or what they're teaching, that is definitely a limitation.
Yeah. Yeah, and I thought it was interesting. The one quote in there that I had read was, "It's virtually impossible to run a school or a library that purges books in response to any complaint from any corner." And I didn't agree with that quote only because of how far it went. So it went in one complete extreme of, there's no area in which parents could express concerns that maybe something isn't age appropriate, that there should be no channel established where parents can express a concern, parents, guardians, over content that is being taught in classrooms, not simply available maybe in libraries, but taught in the classroom. And I think that there is a limit to that, as you talked about, a practical limit. There is a practical limit to the degree that parents can shield their children from everything. My children have heard things at school. We homeschooled them for 2 years. They went back to public school last spring, and I don't think it's because they suddenly walked into public school. It's just that my children were 2 years older, and so the conversations were very different, for instance, in fourth grade than they were in second.
Right.
And so, for instance, Isaiah would come home and he would have some topics of discussion that shouldn't have surprised us, I guess, but some of the ways that they were communicated did. I can't protect them from that exposure all the time. But we can continue to have influence by speaking to those things. I don't think that parents should ever say, well, we don't talk about that. And now there are things we can't dive into. There are certainly topics you can't say, well, let's go ahead and unpack that. I'll define that for you. But there's a way to frame things into, this is why we are not diving into this. This is why we're not talking about this. It's related to this topic or whatever. But I think that parents can continue to be invested in the lives of their children, to be influential to shaping some of these beliefs about content and some of the depth that they're taught, and whether or not these things are morally acceptable behaviors, for instance. And so I think that there is a limit, though, when we look at, so not the influence, but there is a limit to the practical application of, we obviously can't just, every single parent walk into a classroom and say, well, you're not going to teach this. You're not going to teach that. And a teacher has to respond immediately to, well, we're just dropping this from the curriculum when that curriculum has been developed at a school district level, a state, a federal level. Now we just walk in the door and you're going to stop teaching that halfway through a unit. That's just not going to happen.
Right.
So there are practical limits. Do you have anything else to add on that one prompt before we go into the third one?
Well, you read that comment from the gentleman. It said it's virtually impossible to run a school or library that purges books in response to comments from any corner. And while that's kind of a sweeping statement, I'd like to shed a little bit of light on just maybe what he may have meant by saying that. It's up to our school board or our building administrator or someone to make decisions about what books are in the library. And again, if I've been a mother who's been at school and I've been communicating to the teacher and the administration that I don't want my kids reading about X, Y, and Z, then that administrator or teacher may know that, and they'll know that's my concern. But at the same time, your family may have maybe a non-traditional family, and you've gone in and you've expressed, hey, this is the kind of family that we are, and we advocate for our kids to read about it, to see that there are other families that live like this, and so forth. So you have two opposing ideas of what is healthy for a child, and you have kind of someone trying to make these decisions, and it's really an impossible task.
Oh, absolutely.
If my ideas of what are okay and yours are different.
Yeah.
So that may be where he was coming from. I don't know, but.
Yeah, and I think that's a very generous way and perhaps the accurate way, I don't know, to interpret his words. That does get back to the heart, though, that as parents, as guardians,
Hmm.
if we want to have an influence over the lives of our children, we understand our community. We're going to have very different ideas of what that
Yes.
looks like. We need to be gracious and loving towards
Hmm.
people. We need to be influential to the degree that we can. And if you feel so led to be a decision maker who is
Hmm.
settling those issues, and bless you if you want to be that person, but if you want to be the person who makes that decision, then you can certainly run for those offices or
Hmm.
apply for those positions. But if we're not, we do need to be praying for people in that decision making process,
Hmm.
because they are trying to be worldview neutral. I trust in many cases. I trust that these are good, qualified people. Parents should want to be influential. I don't think that there's something morally wrong, as we described, about being invested in the education of our children, whatever your worldview assumptions might be.
Hmm.
We encourage parents to be involved. You are uniquely accountable to God for your involvement, but we need to pray for these decision makers.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, and so I'm going to ask you to kind of look into the future here to the degree that you can, which is very limited,
I know.
because none of us can tell the future. But where do you envision these challenges to curriculum or book availability in libraries going?
Okay. Well, that is a tough question.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the library's mission is to lend books that have just come available and also historical books. But as long as there are new books coming out, it's going to be the library's mission to get a hold of them and let people sign them out and read them.
Mm.
And, the library is one of the last few free places in our nation, across the country, and communities in which we live,
Mm-hmm.
where we can go and, enjoy or learn at no charge.
Right.
And so uh, I think we might need to differentiate between the public school library and the public library
Yes.
for this conversation. So what I'd hope to see is, again, those school officials looking constructively at materials that are there and deciding, making informed decisions about what's appropriate, what's not,
Mm-hmm.
or what's appropriate for which age.
Yes.
One of the things that concerns me, though you alluded to, is who gets to define the word healthy.
Mm.
And again, it's going to have broad cultural implications because there are a great variety
Yeah.
of values in our country right now.
Do you think Christians should excuse themselves from that discussion of what's healthy? Do you think we should say, well, I don't want to push my beliefs and values. Yes, we have competing, but I don't want mine to be expressed. So I'm going to excuse myself from that discussion.
Well, I think there are healthy ways to convey your beliefs
Mm-hmm.
that aren't destructive.
Amen.
And I think you will be heard better when you go in rationally and tactfully and express your position than by, I guess I want to use the word ranting, going in and just being very vocal. It tends to turn off the people who can help you when you're not speaking to them kindly.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a way to say what you need to say and get your point across, I believe, that is healthy and also sets a great example for your kids.
Yeah.
So that they are modeling the same kinds of things.
Mm.
And also have to say that goes for social media too,
Ooh.
where we're not staring somebody in the eye and saying unkind things, but having to think before we post or
Mm-hmm.
maybe take down something we shouldn't have. I've done that before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have as well. I mean, it's you're reactionary and something strikes you emotionally,
Mm-hmm.
and you respond. I think it would be ironic to express concern. I don't want my second grader to be learning about this in school because it's not age appropriate, and then you're setting an example for them by yelling profanities on social media or
Mm-hmm.
saying things that are very hateful and rude in a public sector where there's other children or
Right.
people hearing. That doesn't accomplish.
No, and I think you'll be respected and your voice will be heard better, for having done it.
Yes.
And again, your point, I think, is to advocate for your child and to inform. And so doing so in a respectful way is just more productive that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
I see, as I envision the future here a little bit, I do see increased conflict because we are living in polarizing
Mm-hmm.
times. And that's something as Christians, as Julie just described, I think we can do our best to hinder further conflict, or to maybe we need to make sure that we don't escalate things. De-escalate's the word I'm looking for. So we need to de-escalate, so not be the one who's just trying to yell the loudest. But I don't think Christians should excuse themselves entirely from this. I think it's important that because we love our neighbor, we want our neighbor to know what is true along with God's creation. So He has created this world in His image. He has created men and women in His image. He has created things according to His design and purpose. And so I think it is a good that we contend for those things in appropriate ways, using appropriate methods and models. And if we go through the appropriate streams and those are not received in our public school situations, for instance, we do have other outlets like homeschooling, sending our children to private education if one is able to, and those sort of things. So there are other outlets or other educational opportunities to explore with our children if going through the appropriate channels in a sound way is not received well. But we do understand. But I do think that there are going to be there's going to be increased discussions about what is age appropriate. And I think that those are important discussions that need to be had. And I think it's probably going to lead to conflict both at the local level, probably, within our school districts, within state and federal levels as well. I think that we're probably going to continue to see conflict there. But as Christians, we should continue to do the best we can with whatever is being communicated to come alongside our children, to lead by example, to describe how we as Christians respond to different challenges, to things that they are being taught, even if we can't control all of the content that they are hearing, and we're not going to. So our children, as I described in fourth grade, I couldn't control, but parents with teenagers, you can do the best you can. You can and should put up parental guidelines and restraints where you can't, but where you cannot, that doesn't mean that your influence is gone.
That's right.
You failed. I mean, you have an opportunity to speak through those things.
And we have an obligation as well, not only to advocate for our children and make decisions on as we feel are in their best interest, but also to pray. If you can't get the results you need from your local school board, we need to pray for those leaders. The Lord can still work even though we're not there. And also a reminder that in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, your school board, your school district is its own governmental entity. So calling your senator or your representative or your county, that's not going to get you anywhere. You have to work through them. And as Pastor said, there are those options, but trying to do what we can do and be an influence in the place we're placed, where we have some influence, we're always called to do that.
Amen.
And again, if we are unkind to people, just have to say this, we don't want to be the believer that burns the bridge with the person who needs Him most.
Amen.
And so another reason to be gracious and merciful and kind in the ways that we say things, thoughtful in the way that we present ourselves.
Well said. With that, we're going to look at one other article. And as you look up education, Christianity, these conflicts in worldview, values are presented in many different ways. But there was an article that I saw last week that stuck out to me because it was a direct conflict of a secular worldview and a biblical one involving the state's role in educational funding, or funding within education, I should say. And that was an article by the Christian Headlines, and it was called Biden Admin OK's Christian Schools Lunch Funding After Suit Over Bible and LGBT Beliefs. And what this is discussing is an interpretation by the current administration on the interpretation of Title IX, a 1972 law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, but that the administration interprets as also applying to sexual orientation and gender identity. Grant Park Christian Academy in Tampa filed suit alleging the policy violates federal law and schools' free speech and religious liberty rights under the U.S. Constitution. And so what their suit involved was, and it was brought by the Alliance Defending Freedom. What it stated was that there were 56 children in their school who received free lunch, but they would not have access to that because the private school itself had values that were in conflict with the current administration's interpretation of Title IX. Namely, that they taught that marriage has only one legitimate meaning, and that is marriage sanctioned by God, which joins one man and one woman. And so that is a historic Christian belief. And so they have stood upon that principle. And because they had, then they were not going to receive funding for school lunches for these 56 kids who needed them. So they brought this challenge, and the Biden administration responded. They okayed this funding to be received by the school. And so these children, as their school year may have already begun. I know in the South, some people were posting back to school pictures at the end of July, which is crazy to me. But I'm sorry, kids. But their summer starts earlier there.
Yes,
so
it does,
yeah, so it's always nice there. But with that, these children do have food right now. But with that, a couple of prompts that just developed from that whole article and discussion. What worldview challenges do private and or Christian schools face in our contemporary society?
Well, I have to say something before we even get to
That's
that
fine.
prompt, because it speaks volumes to me that a government entity would not provide lunches to kids who need it, American children who need a meal. And it's not the children who have this LGBT philosophy, it's the school they attend. And so it's not harming the school whatsoever, it's harming the children. And that's very troubling.
Isn't it troubling as we look at it from a worldview perspective, that children so often receive the negative consequences from decisions that adults make?
Yes.
Like they're pawns, and regardless of where you stand on different, I think that most people would agree that children should not be kind of a political football.
That's right. Yeah. Yes, I do agree with that. And I guess that just blatantly stood out to me, and just before even the headline or whatever, that I've struggled with that all week. But this is an example of something that Christian schools and businesses and organizations face. You remember the number of years ago, even businesses that wouldn't provide, for example, a wedding cake for a gay or lesbian marriage or those different things. And so I think this kind of comes out of some of that thought was, okay, well, we'll do destruction the way we can. They don't receive any government funding. So, what do we have? What tactics do we have? But the idea that some are hated again because their issue isn't supported baffles me. That we can't agree to disagree, or that, those parents could take their kids out of that school, but they've obviously put them there for a reason. And so it just troubles me in that respect as well. And everybody has convictions, right? It doesn't matter. We're a country of convictions. And that doesn't mean that because your convictions are different than mine, I write you off. Again, we can agree to disagree. We can work together as best we can given those. Lots of times the things we're working with people we disagree with have nothing to do about those issues.
Yeah.
We're working for a common good or something. But there's a lot of talk too about our culture being a post-Christian culture. And I kind of looked that up just to make sure that my understanding of it was what I thought it was. And the principle, and not everybody agrees, but the idea that that a society used to be based upon Christian ideals and simplified Christian values, such as like Andy Griffith's Mayberry, right? But that it now rejects the authority of Christianity and does not consider it to be the basis of its ethics or culture. At one time it was, but now it's not. We're trying for something different. And then the outcome of that is that at best, the society picks and chooses which tenets of that faith that they want to follow while dismissing other ones. So while some of us are trying to adhere to those and still live spirit-filled, godly lives, sometimes then we become kind of in the crosshairs of opposing views. Yeah. Or we're old-fashioned, or we're stodgy, or whatever adjective you want to apply. Although that's really no surprise, because 1 Corinthians 1, starting in verse 18 and following, it tells us that the message of the cross is foolishness. Not that it's not understood, but that it's foolishness, and so we should really expect nothing less really as believers.
Right.
Yeah, but I think I feel like we also are always at conflict with this notion of being an American patriot versus being a Christian, and what does that look like, and are they the same? And in our country, a lot of it has been the same. We sing "God Bless America" at ball games, and yet there's a disconnect. We're given many more freedoms as Americans than we are as Christians, and sometimes we get one before the other, I feel like.
Do you think it's important that we understand that while we are Americans, that our Christian identity is not defined by our nationality?
Yeah, I think we're spoiled. Is kind of what I think.
Yeah, as I was thinking through the worldview challenges faced, I'll ask you, those viewing, in which year did we see religious liberty in the United States realized? And some may go back to the 1790s, and so the year would be 1831. And so, well, the significance there is that the states that ratified the U.S. Constitution, that in many states you had state religions, which is hard for us to. Pennsylvania did not, for instance, but other states did, and Massachusetts, for one, had congregational churches. And so, what happened there with the congregational churches is that, say, if you were a member, let's put Linesville in Massachusetts, okay, so do that in your mind, back in the 1800s, early 1800s, and whatever attire you envision in your mind. So, say you were there and you were a Baptist. Well, you were really a Congregationalist, but you were confused. So that was the state's perspective. And so what you would have to do is you would have to pay taxes to fund the upkeep of the church building and the salary for the minister of the Congregational church. Now, if on top of that you wanted to give to another entity, then you were free to do that. But they got to determine the tax that was acceptable. And you can imagine that that would sting your conscience, because you would say, as a Baptist, or if you were in this, and I'm putting other groups in this context, but say Roman Catholic, or didn't exist, but the Methodists, if you had, so we're going to go that way. But whatever other denomination you might belong to, or faith tradition, you wouldn't want to give that money above and beyond, because you're trying to support another ministry. But the state would impose this belief upon you, and there were legal consequences. You could be fined, you could be imprisoned. The most famous example of this is Isaac Backus, if you were to read about him. And so there were people who were being fined and imprisoned because they were not supporting local churches. And so the state had this influence over them until 1831. Well, with that, we would agree that I trust most Americans that the state does not have a valid interest in establishing a religion, a state religion. I would say in today's using today's academic wording, that we would assume that our state would take a neutral worldview posturing, that they would not endorse any worldview, whether it was religious or irreligious, or according to one religion or versus another, that they wouldn't prioritize one over the other. Because to do so would be to establish a state religion. And if they were to establish a state religion, necessarily there would be financial consequences for not adhering to that state religion. And if we were talking about this in religious terms, everybody would nod their head along. But when we start using the word worldview, then some would disagree, because they would say, well, the state has taken a neutral posture because they have embraced secularism. But secularism is not a neutral worldview. As we find increasingly in our society, it is opposed to religious worldviews, not just Christian worldviews, but certainly Christian worldviews. And this is a case of that, where a lawsuit had to be brought to allow a Christian school governed by biblical values and principles, in accordance with its beliefs and, again, worldview assumptions, that this group would be under threat they would be under threat of not receiving financial benefits because they did not adhere to the government's worldview. And that's problematic.
It's frightening.
It is. And so as you hear that, you should not be thinking, well, I don't send my kids to a private Christian school, so it doesn't affect me. Because the reality is that this affects all believers. And by the way, not just Christians. This actually affects everybody, whether you're a secularist or a Buddhist or a Christian, whatever you happen to be, because nobody wants the state to determine a valid religious conviction or a valid worldview conviction and then to punish those who do not align with it. To put this in very secular terms, imagine if there was a musician who opposed a politician and that politician were to win the next presidential election. And then that person who had written songs about them was forced to sing at that inauguration because the person wanted them almost to make a mockery, regardless of what their desire was to have them. They wanted to have that artist perform. And the artist would have no right to determine how their freedom of speech was utilized, their expression of their individuality and what their creative genius produced. They would be forced by the state to sing at that inauguration. Well, we would agree that nobody should be forced to do that. But we do find that so often there are efforts to force people of religious convictions to submit to a secular worldview or else receive civil or even in some places criminal consequences for that. And so that is concerning. That's concerning for us. And even for this Christian school's perspective, even though this worked out in their favor, this really is poor exposure. Because there are going to be people who assume that they're bigots because they hold to a biblical worldview, they hold to traditional Christian values, and because this had to go to court, this looks perhaps bad to them and could potentially affect their enrollment one way or another. Maybe there are some people who say, well, this really encourages us, we'll send our kids there, but there are going to be other people who say, I don't need the stigma, I don't need my neighbors down the road to see my sign in my front yard saying I send my kids to school, because they just see headlines and they assume that there's issues here.
Right. And this is far reaching too, in the sense that there are thousands of Christian schools across the nation. Everyone I've ever taught at has that in their beliefs, that marriage is between one man and one woman. And so it may seem like it's a Florida thing or it's that school's thing, but it really has the potential to impact very many people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we were going to have two processes. We discussed both. And so I don't think we have to supplement that in any way.
Sounds good.
I thought it was a really good discussion, and we can unpack this conflict, this kind of convergence of worldviews and assumptions, and where policies meet secular and Christian worldviews, and where that divergence is, and what happens from there. But I hope that our conversation, what it does is it causes you to think through your responsibility as a parent, as a taxpayer, as a policymaker, a decision maker, that you'd be praying for those in our school districts, for teachers, for others in the educational systems who are being confronted with challenges, who have to make these tough decisions, that you'd be praying for parents who are responding maybe positively towards things or saying, I want this removed, that they would be gracious in their demeanor, that there could be civility in our country, that there would be a de-escalation of some of the heightened animosity towards people on competing sides. And I really hope those are your big takeaways. Anything else you'd like to say there as we move towards closing?
No, I just really appreciate your having me. And I do have copies of the articles. If you can't access them online or you've used up your New York Times free articles, feel free to ask if you can take a look at mine.
Wonderful. Well, I look forward to being back next week. I will have another guest with me next week. So I actually have a few lined up over the next couple of weeks. So if you love the monologue, I'm sorry, but if you despise the monologue setup, you should be very excited. So may the Lord bless you.